which was suggested initially by Debbie, I think. Reduce that. So, right, books have been banned for as long as people have been writing things down. Besides outright bans, books can be made difficult to access by being removed from schools or libraries. Sometimes authors and publishers censor themselves if they're fearful of publishing work that might get them in trouble. Despite governments issuing guarantees of freedom of speech, books have continued to be banned and the rights of readers restricted. Many provocative and innovative literature's publications' sale or availability has been curtailed at some point in history. Such censorship is usually counterproductive, as restricting access to a book serves only to create a bestseller, because many want to read a book that is forbidden. So the earliest recorded instance of banning books was in China. Qin Shi Huang, who was the first emperor of China, he was the first to unite the various provinces, and this happened in 221 BCE. The burning of the books and the burying of the philosophers took place in 213 to 212 BCE, when countless poetry, history, and philosophy texts were destroyed, particularly Confucian texts and those of the 100 schools of thought. Private book ownership became forbidden. Qin kept copies of the books he burned, but scholars who might know the text were not spared, and they were buried alive with their books sometimes. From that point forward, anyone who criticized Qin's regime or even discussed the ideas in the banned books was executed, along with all their relatives. The elimination of offending materials in the ancient world, particularly through fire, was seen as necessary to appease the gods and cleanse the collective soul of the pollution of the banned books. In ancient Athens, ridicule and criticism of authority was tolerated, and to question official truths during times of peace and prosperity was simply seen as an irritation. That's if there was good general welfare, which was evidence that the gods neither noticed or cared much. But when there was troubled times, this was another matter. In times of plague or defeat in war, it became obvious that the gods were displeased, so scapegoats were found. Philosophers and anyone who had been poking fun at religious beliefs were targeted. The philosopher Anaxagoras had questioned the existence of the gods. He argued that the sun was not a god, but just simply a hunk of hot rock. He only escaped death when his former pupil, Pericles, arranged his exile to Asia Minor. Socrates was put on trial for impiety in 399 BCE. His relentless questioning of everything had become too much to bear, and Athenians could no longer tolerate his presence in the city. His death sentence was carried out by him drinking hemlock. Later, Aristotle was also denounced for impiety, prompting him to flee Athens, saying, "I will not allow the Athenians to sin twice against philosophy," an obvious reference to the execution of Socrates. Then along came Plato and his book, The Republic. In The Republic, he describes his ideal state. He detailed a system of restrictions starting in the nursery, designed to exclude all subversive notions from the consciousness of the Republic's future guardians. He maintained that anything in the intellectual and cultural diet that encourages freedom of thought, curiosity, or exploration should be suppressed. In the perfect republic, art is a tool of state policy. And if it diverts from that purpose, art and the artist must go. Plato thought that he and the ruling elite were impervious to the weakening influences of texts that would have had harmful effects on the more impressionable members of society. In Plato's Republic, the youth of the ruling class were the ones to be shielded. In coming centuries, other groups, primarily women and poorer classes, would be deemed too mentally weak or politically threatening to consume what the censors and their associates enjoyed. These ideas set much of the tone and define many of the assumptions underlying subsequent Western censorship, seeing the duty of the ruling elite to mould the minds for their own and the state's benefit. The origin of the term censor is traced to the office of censor created in ancient Rome around 443 BCE. Just as in ancient Greece, the Roman ideal of good governance included shaping the character of the people. Censorship was thus regarded as an honourable task, and the office came to be associated with maintaining the moral standards within the community. Roman authorities rarely hesitated to destroy a text or image to appease the gods and protect the privileges of the ruling elite. As the Roman Republic gave way to the empire, the freedom of speech of citizens diminished considerably, and censorship evolved from an ad hoc responses to a deliberate, if often ineffective, tool of state policy. The bonfires of condemned texts increased in size and number, but copies often survived, only to become more coveted as forbidden fruit. The establishment of the Roman Empire saw the interests of the state and of the emperor merged, and anything causing even the most unjustified imperial fear could be framed as treasonous. Emperor Caesar Augustus was also Pontifex Maximus, the empire's highest religious official, and it was in this capacity that he first had thousands of books burned in 12 BCE. 20 years later, during the widespread famine, educators were restricted and political tracts were seized and burned. Under the Emperor Tiberius, the repressive net was cast even wider, and the charges grew flimsier and the punishments became more severe. In the forming of the Catholic Church, within Rome, there had to be agreed texts that formed the Bible. Christians in Rome had been persecuted and their books banned or burned. But once after they became the state religion, after Christianity became the state religion, instead of being open to other things, they did exactly the same. At the Council of Rome in 382, a list of books of scripture were made canonical. These were confirmed at later synods and councils, ending in the Council of Trent in 1563. The canon consisted of 46 books in the Old Testament and 27 books in the New Testament, which makes for a total of 73 books in the Catholic Bible. Other Bibles have different numbers. The Bible, for example, the Bible of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church contains many more books, up to, I think, 84. Books that did not fit with the church's views were suppressed, meaning that some scriptures mentioned in the New Testament do not appear in the Old Testament. Early in the medieval period, there was an ad hoc approach to the banning of books deemed heretical. Early Christians often spoke of books as a kind of body that demons could inhabit. So the best way to get rid of the demons was to burn the books. In 1121, the medieval philosopher and theologian Abelard was forced to burn his own book at the Council of Soissons. As with many instances of book burning, it was a highly public act. Sappho, the famed poet of Lesbos, was born around 615 BCE, but over a millennium and a half later, in 1073, Pope Gregory VII called for her writings to be burnt publicly in Rome. With the invention of the printing press, modern censorship began in earnest. Previously, debates were conducted largely through letters or in person. It took a lot of time for ideas and opposing ideas to spread. Printing pushed opinions onto mass audiences and allowed anyone to respond or jump in with their own contributions. Print's destructive potential was not lost on secular or religious establishments. As early as 1501, Pope Alexander VI declared that print would widen the influence of pernicious works and concluded that full control over printers was necessary. Governments, meanwhile, began to pass more and more restrictive laws. Vague censorship standards were set, but these measures were later swamped when Martin Luther challenged the Church's hegemony on faith and kick-started the Protestant Reformation. Luther and the press were made for each other. He used plain, emotional language and produced pamphlets at an amazing rate. No sooner would one of Luther's targets respond to his printed diatribes than he would discover that the market was flooded with more provocative ones. And the church found that it was impossible to stop them. As the Reformation spread, Catholics and Protestants hardened their positions and censorship laws proliferated. The Inquisition and Catholic princes burnt Protestant literature, while Protestant authorities burned the texts of Catholics and Jews and rival Protestant sects as they multiplied, and each would burn each other's texts. After a half a century of chaos, authorities systemized their censorship efforts, issuing catalogues of offending books and licensing schemes to pre-clear or refuse texts and impose import restrictions. The most important of these was the Vatican's Index of Forbidden Books, the Index Liborium Prohibitorum, issued in 1559. The first index proved too draconian even for the Catholic authorities, and many of the city-states refused to implement it. So it was modified in 1564. The new index was always a work in progress, and it continued to be added to and adapted until it was finally abolished, and that was in 1966. It included elaborate pre-publication and enforcement rules, but if a book's chief matter was good, even though it contained some errors, the church would tolerate it if the offending passages were expurgated. This policy made allowances for some scientific books by Protestant authors, but it also led to some peculiar results with sections of books censored, which made the rest of the book nonsensical. In Europe of the 16th and 17th centuries, boundaries were being drawn and redrawn by the era's religious and secular wars. It was not difficult to avoid censorship decrees and ignore the index by using elaborate clandestine networks. Banned books were often tended to become more popular because they were prohibited. And a book could be banned in one state and then allowed in another, which allowed for a lot of illegal imports and exports. When Galileo's dialogue on two world systems went on the index in the early 17th century, even Catholic monks rushed to get it, helping to push the black market price up to 10 times the original. One German publisher is reported of telling his authors to write anything that will be forbidden, because those were the books that started to sell. In England, during the reign of Elizabeth I, and well into the 17th century, the government monopolised the printing trade through the Stationers' Company. Nothing could be printed, nor could a printer operate without its approval. This all stemmed after a book that was written about Elizabeth's proposed French marriage. Parliament became a major engine of speech suppression in the 16th and 17th century England. It stifled public knowledge about its own proceedings and punished slights against itself and its members. Ironically, these repressions grew from Parliament's appeals for freedom of speech within Parliament and with its interactions with the Crown. There was a brief period of openness during the War of the Three Kingdoms when radical groups like the Levellers espoused the ideas of free speech for all. In 1689, the English Bill of Rights finally guaranteed the freedom of speech and debate in Parliament, but that guarantee did not extend to the citizenry or to the press. The 17th century English censor, Roger Lestrange, summed up the official attitudes when he wrote that public newspapers must be suppressed because they make the multitude too familiar with the actions of their superiors. The American colonies adopted English speech restrictions wholesale. Having left England to preserve their freedom of thought and expression, the colonial authorities did not believe in equal freedom of thought and expression for others who had ideas and opinions that may contradict their own. In the 18th century, there was increasingly strong drives to have unrestrained debate. This was often led by groups seeking power. And then only what happened is those same groups then slammed the door shut once their political objectives were realized. The milestones of the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen and the United States First Amendment were written, but the broad ideals expressed by these documents would not come close to being made a practical reality for quite some time. The uneven spread of prosperity and literacy, the start of the Great Migration from the countryside to the cities as the Industrial Revolution started to get underway, and the rush of information across borders and among classes rattled institutions at their foundations. The old rationales for state authority were challenged, and there was ever more demands for reform. Freedom of speech became a rallying cry, and the British, French, and American regimes all frantically tried to maintain control by restricting the press and individual expression. There appeared a wide gulf between arguing for free expression and adopting it as government policy, and there was many similarities between pre- and post-revolutionary orders. In 1792, 3 years after the freedom of speech and press was guaranteed in France, censorship returned with deadly force. Books were burned and writers out of step with the regime were persecuted and killed. In the United States in 1798, just a few years after the First Amendment was ratified, Congress passed a sedition law criminalizing most political dissent. The main thrust of censorship in the 19th century was against the lower classes and driven by the ruling class conviction that an informed population would become a revolutionary population, and that would lead to their own demise. Measures consistently were geared towards deflecting troublesome ideas away from the poor. A novel or story might be barred if sold at a low price, but approved if priced so that only the well-off could afford it. Media consumed in groups or that did not require reading, such as caricatures, remained of particular concern to the censors. Yet despite thousands of censorship bans, prosecutions, jail terms and fines, the circulation of ideas and information was never effectively stopped. There was just too much out there for the authorities to chase down, and the systems of speech repression was plagued by varying degrees of corruption, maladministration and stiff resistance. Alongside the suppression of political thought, the other great obsession of the authorities in the 19th century was sex. Whereas men of standing consider themselves immune to bad influences from pornography, lower orders were seen as licentious by nature. Their access to dirty books had to be limited because erotic stimulation supposedly sparked criminality, and that brought disorder and property loss. The key group driving English obscenity persecutions was the Society for the Suppression of Vice, a collection of rich self-appointed moralists dedicated, according to one satirist, to suppressing the vices of persons whose incomes do not exceed £500 per annum. Onto these worries was spread a thick coat of sexism, with obscenity laws used to protect respectable females from their own sex urges. Much of the legal assault on sexually arousing material was based on the assumption that exposing women to pornography would rouse them to uncontrollable lust, leading to the destruction of the family, home, and all that is well and good in society. Enormous efforts were also made to keep anything considered sacrilegious away from the poor, as uncritical acceptance of Christianity was thought necessary for them, because without the consolation of religion, they might not accept the bitterness of their lives in return for rewards in the hereafter. In 1868, a case was brought against the Confessional Unmasked, a pamphlet about the depravity of Catholic priests and their licentious questions they put to females in confession. The pamphlet was intended to knock Catholicism rather than arouse, but it was seized upon, and the decision in the Queen versus Hincklin set the standard for British and later American obscenity laws well into the 20th century. Under what became known as the Hincklin test, an entire work could be banned if even one isolated passage was deemed to deprave and corrupt any segment of the population whose minds were believed to be vulnerable. The Hincklin test was supposed to be about pornography, but it also encouraged censorship of serious works of art, literature, and even scientific inquiry. In fact, the Hincklin test was no test at all. It simply articulated a prevailing prejudice regarding class and gender differences and urged that obscenity rulings be guided by it. Scientific materials were kept away from general audiences, most notably Sexual Inversion, a book co-written by the physician and sexuality researcher Havelock Ellis in 1898. The study involved the case histories of 27 gay people, or inverts as they were known. It was meant to challenge the assumptions behind a recent statute prescribing 2 years in prison for people who committed gross indecencies. The law responded by labelling the study obscene and suppressing it. The book was not seen as a means to advance knowledge or promote discussion, but to stimulate, to quote, disorder and lustful desires and bring readers to a state of wickedness, lewdness, and debauchery. The American responses to pornography centered on the moral crusader Anthony Comstock and the federal law informally bearing his name. This law criminalized the use of mail to transmit anything deemed indecent. Backed by wealthy patrons and the YMCA, he established the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice in 1873, and the Comstock Act was signed by the President Grant that year. The new law prohibited much more than explicit material. In addition to everything deemed indecent or immoral, contraceptives and any information regarding birth control or abortion was banned. Comstock was later appointed as postal inspector, and the Act, along with the American court decisions adopting the Broad-Hinckley test for obscenity, gave him almost limitless power. Under the Comstock Act, works by Chaucer, Tolstoy, James Joyce, William Faulkner, Ernest Hemingway, and William Burroughs, amongst many others, were banned. The suppression of political writings in the US began with the attempts of the southern slave-owning states to suppress abolitionist writings from entering from the north. States passed laws with sentences ranging from long-term imprisonment to death, the death penalty, for producing or distributing abolitionist writings, and later even for talking about it. It was also a criminal offense to teach a slave to read. Once the Civil War began, Lincoln's government introduced harsh punishments for anyone questioning the war, and later the introduction of conscription. These were not always successful in quelling dissent, but more importantly, they set a precedent for future suppression of opinions deemed unpatriotic. Absolutist, autocratic, authoritarian and totalitarian regimes have always had much wider definition of what is deemed subversive. This has continued through to today, and to look at books banned in these regimes would take far too long. So from now on, we're going to concentrate on the Western democracies. Continuing from the 18th century, and in the ex-Confederate states, all books that did not follow the lost cause or that criticized slavery were banned in schools across the South. In the century's first decade, Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, that was written in 1865, was banned in many American schools for its imagined promotion of sexual fantasies and masturbation. While the anxieties and worries of governments continued, the beginning of the Great War magnified and intensified the control of governments in what people could read. The scope and techniques of censorship was refined and continued for the coming decades. But what was and remains missing was any unified theory or consensus as to why some writings should be censored more than others. The lack of a coherent theory behind censorship makes it, to varying degrees, arbitrary. Beside the banning of anti-war and pacifist books during the war, similar cultural and sexual cleansing efforts were underway in all the countries. Dissent in sex, especially homosexuality, was a favourite target. Rose Alatini's inexplicit novel, Despised and Rejected, which follows the wartime experience of a gay conscientious objector and a lesbian woman, was banned for its threat to the nation's moral health and military success. The publisher's stock of D.H. Lawrence's The Rainbow was seized and destroyed in Britain soon after its 1915 publication. According to one reviewer, a thing like The Rainbow has no right to exist in the wind of war. Much of Britain's cultural censorship continued in the decades following the World War. The state and its surrogates banned books and open mails looking for forbidden material. All the while, the government maintained the public fiction that censorship did not exist. According to its narrow definition, censorship meant only preventing something from being published in the first place. The rest was merely law enforcement. In a 1938 note to the police about a confidential list of books to take off the market, the Home Office stressed the importance of not giving the impression that it or the police were acting in any way as censors or have the power to ban books. Obscenity laws were used to prevent the publication of James Joyce's book Ulysses, and famously D.H. Lawrence's Lady Chatterley's Lover. Radcliffe Hall's The Well of Loneliness was published in 1928 and was probably the first novel in English to treat homosexuality as its central subject. And it was banned once the controversy made it a bestseller and brought it to the attention of the authorities. All nations in the Second World War controlled what could be printed and distributed. In the post-war era, these rules were relaxed as people demanded more freedom to write and publish what they saw fit. In the West, books that would have been suppressed in the past were published and become bestsellers. Of course, all countries have some censorship laws, usually covering obscenity, the corruption of minors, incitement to violence and hatred, and so on. But often this can be used to prevent publication of books on spurious grounds. Books would routinely be challenged, usually on the grounds of explicit sexual references and descriptions, and it was usually only when the Supreme Court judged it suitable that they were published. As society became more socially liberal, it became clear that getting a book banned was becoming harder, if not impossible, and those wanting to restrict certain books had to turn to other methods. All the books you can see there were all challenged at some point and threatened to be banned until they were passed okay by a court judgment. Campaigners in the United States turned to putting pressure on libraries, especially school libraries, to remove certain books from their shelves. This happened to books of a political nature, but it was mainly used against books. This happened to books of a political nature, especially from a left-wing political viewpoint. For example, in the 1960s, Hitler's Mein Kampf was often freely available in libraries, but Malcolm X's autobiography was prescribed. Books were often challenged on false grounds to hide the real reason for not wanting them read. Feminist or women's rights books were targeted as they were seen as attacking family values. Books with a positive gay message soon joined them. More recently, books dealing with the issues of race were targeted, and now books dealing with the issues of gender identity have become the primary target. This was not an ad hoc campaign led by worried parents, but it was led by organised groups involved in pushing for book bans on a national, state or local level. Today, these groups share lists of books to challenge and they employ tactics such as swarming school board meetings, demanding new rating systems for libraries, using inflammatory language about grooming and pornography, and even filing criminal complaints against school officials, teachers, and librarians. In addition to the role played in book banning by these groups, efforts to restrict access to books were also used by government officials and enabled by both state-level legislation and district-level policy changes. There are estimates that at least 40% of the bans counted in the index of school book bans for the 2021-22 school year are connected to political pressure exerted by state officials or elected lawmakers. With the advent of Black Lives Matter movement, a range of individuals and groups started to remove books from school that focused on the issue of race or the history of slavery and racism, mirroring a campaign pushed by some legislators to pass educational gag orders, bills restricting discussion of these and other concepts in school classrooms and curricula. Although the campaign to enact educational gag orders initially focused on the misapplications of the academic term critical race theory to censor discussions of race and racism, over the past year it morphed to include a heightened focus on LGBTQ+ issues and identities. Those demanding book removals increasingly attacked books they claimed featured sexual content, including titles on sexual and reproductive health and sex education. The Parental Rights in Education law in Florida, also known as the Don't Say Gay law, and the introduction of similar legislation in other states, as well as a range of efforts to censor discussions of LGBTQ identities in school in Maryland, Missouri, Texas, and beyond. A third of all book bans feature LGBTQ identities, while nearly 2/3 of all banned books touch on topics related to sexual content, such as teen pregnancy, sexual assault, abortion, sexual health, and puberty. Several books that have become classics have also been banned or challenged. It's impossible to list all of them here, but there are some publications there, literature suppressed on political grounds, etc., that I've put up that you can, if you can find them, you can read those. So here we go. The Grapes of Wrath, that was banned in some schools for being too political. For Whom the Bell Tolls, too political. Animal Farm, too political. And Bury My Heart, a Wounded Knee was also far too political and challenged social norms, apparently. The Kite Runner, that was banned on sexual basis, and To Kill a Mockingbird on profanity. Often, like I say, these weren't the real reasons that they wanted to stop people reading these books. Then there's children's books that have been banned. In the Night Kitchen, that was banned for sexual innuendo. This is because when Mickey, who's one of the main characters, who's about 3 years old, enters the night kitchen, sorry, did I say night garden? I meant night kitchen. He loses his pajamas and is fully naked in some parts of the story. So that was the reason behind that. And Tango Makes Free, that was banned for being pornographic. This is a story about two male penguins making a family together, and it's based on a true story of two male penguins who formed a pair bond in New York Central Park Zoo. So it's actually based on a true story, but still banned. Bridge to Terabithia, that was banned because it's said to encourage children to practice witchcraft. And it was also attacked because of the word Lord was used in it and deemed blasphemous. Here's some more classic books. 1984, that was challenged and banned in some places for sexual content, which is just one small part of the book, actually. The Golden Compass, that was banned on religious grounds for promoting atheism. Lord of the Rings trilogy, that was attacked and banned for promoting sorcery and witchcraft. The Handmaid's Tale and Brave New World were both attacked on the basis of their sexual content. The Canterbury Tales, all these books here were banned on what they call social grounds. Canterbury Tales, sexual content, adultery and farting. I Know Why a Caged Bird Sings. Again, sexual content, rape and homosexuality were the reasons. Captain Underpants series, which is the children's, that was banned on the basis of violent imagery, offensive language and homosexuality. The Basketball Diaries, which was eventually made into a film. Pornography and drug use. Gorillas in the Mist, that was banned in some schools because it described the gorillas' sexual habits. And then we get the most popular one now. LGBTQ plus books are an increasing target with the latest intimidation tactic, as I said earlier, to bring criminal charges against teachers, school boards and libraries on the basis of them distributing pornography. These criminal charges often don't go anywhere, but they're used to basically to intimidate and try and force teachers and librarians to stop discussing or distributing these books. So, to finish, I think we should have a song.
Some parents have a problem with books that are too rough, tackling things like race and gender, or with characters who curse. Our kids are far too precious to expose them to this stuff. The music that they listen to is way, way worse. Don't give a book on CRT to my sweet son or daughter, or about any love but married heterosexual romance. We must shield kids from the sacrilegious spells in Harry Potter and that anti-authoritarian Captain Underpants. Ban the books.
Ban the books.
Ban the books.
Ban the books.
Think of all the minds and hearts they are infecting. Ban the books.
Ban the books.
Let's ban those books.
Ban the books.
Our fragile little angels need protecting. As long as we are at it, it's time that we confront another book that's controversial and quite scary, full of body parts and words that are quite dirty and far too blunt. We need to save our children from the dictionary. Ban the dictionary.
Ban the dictionary.
Ban the dictionary.
Ban the dictionary.
Think of all the minds and hearts it is infecting. Ban the dictionary.
Ban the dictionary.
Let's ban the dictionary.
Ban the dictionary.
Our fragile little angels need protecting. Forbidding what offends us is our First Amendment right. And some ugly things in history are better left unlearned. It could make us feel guilty or not let us sleep at night. So it's high time these disturbing books were all stacked up and burned. I know there was a book about book burning, Fahrenheit something or other, but I never read it because it was banned. And speaking of books that ought to be banned, I mean, what parent lets their children read of human sacrifice? The harm to them is truly undeniable. Slavery, prostitution, and polygamy aren't nice. Since it's full of crap like that, let's ban the Bible. Ban the Bible.
Ban the Bible.
Ban the Bible.
Bible.
Think of all the minds and hearts it is infecting. Ban the Bible.
Ban the
Let's
Bible.
ban the Bible. Because our precious little angels need protecting. Ban the dictionary.
Ban the dictionary.
Ban the Bible.
Ban the
Think
Bible.
of all the minds and hearts they are infecting. Ban the books.
Ban the books.
Ban all the books.
Ban all the books.
Don't fill each dainty head with stuff we've never read. Cause our precious little angels who play violent video games and send each other nude selfies be protected.
Ban all those books.